Shalom and welcome to Yeshua in Context. I'm Derek Lehman. You can find me at dereklehman.com. That's DEREKLEMAN.com. You can also find a lot of free information and inspiration at yeshuaincontext.com. When you open your Bible to Matthew or to John, do you ever think to ask yourself, where did these writings come from? They didn't come down from the sky. And unlike modern books, they don't have in them a title page with information about the author or bibliographical information. There's no Library of Congress information in the front of the Bible or for every book of the Bible. Many people assume certain things about where the Gospels came from or where other biblical books came from. For example, Matthew must be written by some guy named Matthew, right? But wait, where does the book that we call Matthew tell us that its author is someone named Matthew? The title that's printed in your Bible is not actually a part of the book of Matthew. It's a traditional title inserted by publishers. But the New Testament itself doesn't actually tell us that someone named Matthew wrote Matthew. It's a tradition from the 2nd century that Matthew wrote Matthew. There is no Cliff's Notes to help us solve this question, and nobody wrote a history of the authors of the New Testament or told us anything about who they were or when they wrote. What we do have, though, are the Gospels themselves. And in the text of the Gospels, we find some clues about where they came from. I'm going to just briefly summarize a few of the things we know about where the Gospels came from. Number one, the first thing I want you to know about where the Gospels came from is that Mark's Gospel is the earliest. The idea of Mark being the earliest gospel is something we call Markan priority. How can we tell that Mark is the first of the 4 Gospels to be written? Well, there are a number of different reasons, and together they make an overwhelming case for Markan priority. Consider, for example, this. Mark doesn't have a number of things that are included in Matthew and Luke. Things like the Lord's Prayer, the birth stories, the Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, the temptation story of Yeshua in its full length. And, believe it or not, Mark doesn't really have the resurrection, only the empty tomb. What do I mean by that? Look in any modern translation of Mark and you'll see a note that the Gospel of Mark, as far as we know, ends after chapter 16, verse 8. Now, if Matthew and Luke have, for example, the birth stories of Yeshua, would we imagine that Mark would have used Matthew and Luke but would have left the birth stories out? It makes a lot more sense to say that Mark was first and that Matthew and Luke added the birth stories, thinking that it was better to include them in the full telling of the life of Yeshua. And there are other reasons, too, that convince us that Mark was the first gospel. Mark's description of the temple destruction in Mark 13 is really vague. It's as if Mark may not have understood exactly what Yeshua was talking about. Why not? Because it hadn't happened yet. So as Mark put down the words of Yeshua about the temple's destruction, he didn't write it as specifically as Matthew or Luke, who wrote after the temple's destruction in 70 CE. Also, Mark has some stories that Matthew and Luke leave out. Maybe they were embarrassing stories, like the story of Yeshua spitting on the eyes of a blind man in order to heal him. Perhaps Matthew and Luke were taking out some of the embarrassing aspects or leaving out stories that made them uncomfortable or that were difficult for them to explain. Another reason is that in many places Mark's version has some imprecise or striking or somewhat rude language which Matthew and Luke improve on in various ways. The second thing I want you to know is that the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts. I'm holding a copy of Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which details the case for eyewitnesses as the source of the Gospels. Now, that doesn't mean that the authors were eyewitnesses themselves. In fact, I don't think that the author of the books we call Matthew, Mark, or Luke were eyewitnesses to the life of Yeshua. But I do think that the author of John, someone who refers to himself as the beloved disciple, was an eyewitness. However, even he might not be who you think. I'll say more in another video about this concept of the eyewitnesses that we find in the Gospels. But their hand or their presence is very evident. It's people like Peter, or Simon of Cyrene, or Mary Magdalene, Jairus, Bartimaeus, Joanna, Salome, and more. Third, I want you to know that the stories and sayings that are in the Gospels were known a long time before they were written down. These were stories and sayings that were told and retold in congregations throughout the Roman Empire. And they weren't told in an organized or chronological fashion. Different stories were known. Many, many different stories were known. You can see signs of that, for example, if you compare parallel stories that are in more than one gospel. You'll find if you compare the parallel stories that there are similarities and yet there are also differences. Matthew has more material than Mark. And Luke takes that material that's in Matthew, which isn't in Mark, and adds even more material. And then if you look at John, you find a Jerusalem-based perspective with even different material from what's already included in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we can be sure that not all of Yeshua's words and deeds, not even all of the traditions that were known and very familiar to the early believers, are recorded in the four Gospels. Only some of the early tradition of the Yeshua communities about Yeshua's words and deeds are recorded in the four books that we possess. Number 4, the Gospels were written down as the last eyewitnesses were dying out. Just as in the comparable case of the Mishnah in Jewish literature, which was written down at a time where there was a concern that the traditions would be lost if they didn't get put down in writing, so as the eyewitnesses were dying out in the Gospels, clearly this was a time to write them down and to make sure that what had been circulating in the congregations wasn't lost. This storytelling tradition that started with eyewitnesses and was passed down and stories were told and retold, it wasn't necessarily organized into a biography. They weren't put into chronological lists, but someone needed to take that tradition, that body of material, and select from it and organize it and write it down. And that's what the gospel writers were doing, taking a large body of tradition, organizing it, and recording it for posterity. Now you'll read many different theories and variations of theories about how the Gospels came to us. Almost every scholar, though, accepts the idea of Markan priority. And I commend to you among all of the theories that you could read about Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I think gives a very clear and good evidence for the eyewitness theory of the origins of the Gospels. The Gospels are the work of the Yeshua community. The traditions and the stories that began with the eyewitnesses and were told and retold about what Messiah did and what he said. This is Yeshua in Context. I'm Derek Lehman.